A drone hit Moscow this week. Not a military base, not a radar installation on the edge of Russian territory, a residential high-rise in one of the most upscale neighborhoods of the Russian capital. And 3 days later, Vladimir Putin stood up in front of the world for his most important day of the year, Victory Day, with no tanks, no missiles, no military hardware of any kind rolling through Red Square. The journalists were sent home. The dignitaries mostly stayed away. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the Kremlin, and somewhere in that bunker beneath all that paranoia, a question was forming that no amount of state media can suppress. Is Russia actually winning this war? Welcome. What you are about to watch is not just the story of a parade. It is the story of a man and a state that spent 3 years telling the world they were invincible, and the moment that story started to visibly crack. May 9th, 2026, Victory Day, the single most politically sacred day on the Russian calendar. The day Putin uses every year to project power, to wrap himself in the legacy of the Soviet Union's sacrifice in World War II, to line up tanks and intercontinental missiles and march them past the Kremlin walls for the entire world to watch. This year, no tanks, no missiles, no military hardware at all. Most international journalists, including CNN, were told by the Kremlin they were no longer welcome. The guest list, once studded with dozens of world leaders, shrank to a handful of peripheral allies, and a drone had already hit a Moscow apartment building days before. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 things. First, why this parade collapse is far more significant than a mere scheduling change. Second, what it actually reveals about the state of Russia's war machine and Putin's grip on power. And third, what happens next, and why the next 72 hours on the battlefield could be the most consequential since the war began. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. Let us get into it. The preparations for Moscow's Victory Day parade had been underway for weeks. Soldiers rehearsing in St. Petersburg. Red Square draped in the red, white, and blue of the Russian flag. The black and orange St. George's ribbon displayed in shop windows across the capital. The full pageantry of the Russian state was being assembled. Then, piece by piece, it started falling apart. First came the announcement from Russia's defense ministry. No military hardware would be displayed this year, citing, and this phrase matters, the current operational situation. That is the language of a government that cannot afford to pull its tanks off the front line for a parade. Then came the journalist ban. International media outlets, including CNN, who had been formally accredited to attend, received word from the Kremlin on Thursday. You are no longer permitted to come. Only Russian state media and designated host broadcasters would have access. The Kremlin's own spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, denied this had happened, claiming no accreditation was revoked. But the journalists who were turned away had the paperwork to prove it. Then, on Monday, days before the parade, a Ukrainian drone struck a high-rise apartment building in a wealthy central neighborhood of western Moscow. No casualties, but the message was unmistakable. Ukraine's war was no longer confined to the front. It had reached the Russian capital's skyline. By the eve of the parade, anti-aircraft systems were visible around central Moscow. One of Russia's largest telecom operators sent messages to Muscovites, warning them that mobile internet and text messaging could face restrictions during the May 9 festivities. For security, in Moscow, on Russia's most celebrated national holiday. This is not the Victory Day Putin planned, and the world is watching every detail. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, you have to understand what Victory Day means to Vladimir Putin, and what it has always been designed to do. May 9th marks the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. The Great Patriotic War, as Russians call it, claimed an estimated 27 million Soviet lives. The sacrifice is genuine. The grief is real. The memory runs through Russian culture like a river. But Putin has weaponized that memory. Since he came to power in 2000, the Victory Day parade has been transformed from a commemoration into a performance of contemporary military power. Each year brought more hardware: Armata tanks, Topol-M intercontinental ballistic missiles, Yars nuclear delivery systems. Foreign heads of state, sometimes 20 or 30 of them, flew in to sit beside Putin in the reviewing stand. It was broadcast globally. It said, without a single spoken word, Russia is back. Russia is strong. Russia cannot be challenged. The parade became a central pillar of Putin's domestic legitimacy too. In a country with no free elections and no free press, the spectacle of military power was one of the primary ways the state communicated to its own people that their sacrifices, economic, social, personal, were justified by national greatness. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Putin almost certainly believed he would have a victory to celebrate by May 9th of that year. He did not. By May 2023, he was forced to cancel his tank display after Ukraine started striking Russian soil. By May 2024, the parade still ran, but analysts noted fewer systems on display. By May 2025, China's Xi Jinping was flown in as a show of solidarity, and the display continued, but Ukraine was still fighting. Now it is May 2026. The war is in its fourth year. The tanks cannot leave the front. The missiles Putin once paraded as symbols of invincibility are being fired at Ukrainian cities, and Ukrainian drones are flying back the other way, all the way to Moscow. The parade is shrinking because the war is not going as planned. That is the only explanation that fits all the facts. But here is the detail that changes everything you think you know about this story, and most outlets are burying it completely. Vladimir Putin is at the center of this, as he has been since February 2022. But the decisions around this parade reveal a man managing a narrative crisis, not commanding from a position of strength. He is choosing security over spectacle, which means he has accepted, at least privately, that the spectacle is no longer safe. Volodymyr Zelensky is the counterweight. His decision to escalate Ukraine's drone campaign targeting Russian territory, oil refineries, radar installations, and now residential buildings inside Moscow itself, is a deliberate psychological strategy. The goal is not just military, it is to make the Russian population feel the war. To break the comfortable distance between a population that has been told the war is over there and the reality that it is arriving on their doorstep. Zelensky also announced his own ceasefire, starting May 6th, 3 days before Russia's ceasefire. A chess move designed to put Russia in the position of either accepting or visibly violating it. Russia announced its own ceasefire covering May 8th through 9th. Both sides accused the other of breaking it almost immediately. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, is in the unenviable position of being caught in a direct lie. He told the world that no journalist had their accreditation revoked. CNN has documentation proving otherwise. That is not a nuance. That is a demonstrable falsehood, delivered to the global press on the record. Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian strongman, showed up. Of course he did. He has nowhere else to go. His own grip on power depends entirely on Russian backing. Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister, a NATO and European Union member, flew to Moscow for bilateral talks with Putin, but even he drew a line. He said he would not attend the parade. That is a signal. Even the Western leader most sympathetic to Russia's position in this war decided that sitting in that reviewing stand in 2026 was a step too far. The thinning of this guest list is its own geopolitical story. In 2025, Xi Jinping sat beside Putin. This year, China did not send its president. Think about what that absence communicates. Inside Moscow, the mood on the ground is far from the triumphant patriotism the Kremlin broadcasts. Residents CNN spoke to were subdued, cautious, and, in ways that would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago, willing to say out loud that the war needs to end. Mikhail, a Muscovite who gave only his first name, a telling detail in a country where expressing the wrong opinion can end careers or worse, told CNN directly, "It's already time. People are dying, finances are disappearing, and all sorts of restrictions are being introduced. War has never been good." That statement, from an ordinary Russian citizen in Moscow to an international news outlet with camera rolling, is remarkable. It is not the voice of a population rallied behind its leader. It is the voice of exhaustion. A woman named Galina, visiting from Novoazovsk in Russian-occupied Donbass, a region that has been in the grip of this war since Russia backed separatists there in 2014, spoke to CNN while wearing the St. George's ribbon. She said she hopes the war ends soon. "It's the people who suffer," she said. "War is bad for everyone." The mobile internet restrictions warned to Muscovites ahead of the celebrations are not a minor inconvenience. They are the state telling its own citizens, We do not trust you to communicate freely on this day, in this city, at this moment. Anti-aircraft batteries visible in central Moscow are not normal, not for a parade, not for a celebration. They are there because the threat from Ukrainian drones is real, assessed, and taken seriously at the highest levels of the Russian security apparatus. Underneath all the flags and ribbons and rehearsed military formations, the ground reality in Moscow is one of a city bracing, not celebrating. So we have a parade with no weapons, a press ban the Kremlin lied about, drones over Moscow, citizens quietly saying the war should end, and a NATO prime minister who flew all the way to Moscow but refused to be seen at the event. Something is cracking in the Russian state narrative, and the most important fracture is the one nobody is showing you. Stay with us. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part of this story. The world is watching this parade's retreat with a combination of strategic satisfaction and sober concern. In Kyiv, Ukrainian officials read the scaled-down parade as confirmation that their drone campaign is working, not just militarily but psychologically. Ukraine's strategy of striking deep inside Russian territory, targeting energy infrastructure, logistics, and now creating fear in Moscow's residential neighborhoods, is designed to impose costs that the Russian public feels directly. When ordinary Muscovites wake up to drone alerts and mobile internet blackouts on their most sacred holiday, Ukraine's message has landed. Western capitals are responding with measured observation. No NATO leader is declaring victory. Everyone understands that a cornered adversary with a nuclear arsenal is not a situation that invites celebration. But behind closed doors, the intelligence assessment has shifted. Russia's ability to sustain this war, economically, militarily, and in terms of domestic political cohesion, is under increasing pressure. The absence of a strong Chinese presence at this parade is being noted in foreign ministries across Asia and Europe. Xi Jinping made a high-profile appearance in Moscow for Victory Day 2025. His absence, or his decision to send a lower-level delegation this year, is being interpreted in diplomatic circles as a subtle distancing, a signal that Beijing is recalibrating how closely it wants to be seen embracing Moscow while the war drags on and the costs mount. The Kremlin's decision to ban most international press is also drawing sharp reactions from press freedom organizations. Reporters Without Borders called it a further erosion of media access in Russia. The move also backfires strategically. Instead of controlling the image of a confident, powerful Russia, the Kremlin has handed the global press a story about a leader too afraid to let cameras into his own parade. On social media, the images of a nearly weapon-free Red Square, where for years ICBMs rolled in columns past cheering crowds, are going viral for all the wrong reasons from Moscow's perspective. Here is what most of the coverage is missing, and it matters enormously. Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School in New York, and a woman who was recently labeled a foreign agent by Russian authorities for her critical public commentary, told CNN directly that Putin and the Russian security services are gripped by something that goes beyond military calculation. She used one specific word: paranoia. She pointed to a pattern: the assassinations of leaders in Iran, the political turbulence in Venezuela, the assassination attempts on Donald Trump. Putin is watching every major world leader who has faced physical threat or political collapse, and he is calculating his own vulnerability. Add to that the daily reality of Ukrainian drone swarms, described by Khrushcheva as hundreds of drones launched from Ukraine daily, and the picture that emerges is not a confident strongman managing a difficult war. It is a leader in a bunker mentality, surrounded by loyalists, cutting off information flows and pulling inward. The decision to bar international journalists is not just censorship, it is a security decision. The Kremlin does not trust that even credentialed, known international reporters can be vetted safely in a crowd around Putin on May 9th. That is an extraordinary level of threat assessment for your own capital city on your own national holiday. There is one more layer here. Russia's economy is slowing. Internet restrictions have been expanding, causing daily disruption across the country. The Kremlin has framed these as necessary wartime measures. But the compound effect, war fatigue, economic pressure, surveillance creep, restricted information, is creating a domestic environment that is nothing like the triumphant narrative Putin has spent 2 decades building. The parade is smaller this year because Russia is smaller this year. Not in territory, but in confidence, in reach, in the sheer capacity to project the image Putin has always relied on. An image, for this Kremlin, has always been half the strategy. We started by asking a simple question. If Russia is winning this war, why can Putin not safely hold his own victory parade? We are about to answer that, and the answer has consequences that reach far beyond Moscow, far beyond Ukraine, and directly into decisions being made right now in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. Let us be precise about what is at risk here, because the stakes of this moment extend in every direction. For Putin, the domestic stakes could not be higher. The Victory Day parade is not just propaganda. It is a social contract. It is the moment each year when the Russian state tells its population, your sacrifice, your sons on the front, your economic pain, your restricted internet, your closed borders, all of it is worth it, because Russia is great and Russia is winning. A shrunken, weaponless parade with mobile internet blackouts and drone alerts does not deliver that message. It delivers the opposite. For Ukraine, the stakes are about sustainability. The drone campaign reaching Moscow costs Ukraine resources, but if it forces Russia to divert air defense systems from the front to the capital, which it appears to be doing, then it is militarily rational. The deeper question is whether the West continues to supply the weapons and funding Ukraine needs to maintain this pressure. Every week that question is live, and every week the answer is not guaranteed. For Europe and NATO, the stakes are about the credibility of deterrence. If Russia cannot sustain its own war narrative at home, does that make Putin more dangerous, more likely to reach for an escalatory option to reset the story? Or does domestic pressure eventually force a negotiated exit? This is the central debate in every European capital right now. There is no consensus. For the global order, this moment is one more data point in a years-long stress test. The post-Cold War architecture, international law, sovereignty, rules-based order, has been under assault since February 2022. Every month this war continues, the norms erode a little further. The worst case, Putin, facing domestic fracture and military stalemate, reaches for a dramatic escalation, a tactical nuclear demonstration, a massive strike on a NATO-adjacent target, something designed to shock the situation back to Russian advantage. Analysts call this the cornered bear scenario. It is low probability, but non-zero. And this parade, stripped of its hardware, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, is a data point that moves that probability slightly upward. Sam Green, professor of Russian politics at King's College London, offered CNN one of the clearest analytical frames for this moment. He said Putin likes to look in control and wants the Russian state to look strong, and that is not the message this sends. He called the scaled-back parade out of character for the Russian leader. That assessment matters because Green is not a polemicist. He is a careful academic observer who rarely reaches for dramatic language. When he says this is out of character, he means the deviation from pattern is significant. Nina Khrushcheva's framing, paranoia at every turn, adds the psychological dimension. A leader who is recalibrating his own physical security based on what happened to leaders in Iran and Venezuela is a leader who does not feel invulnerable. That is a change in the internal calculus of Russian power that could push decision-making in unpredictable directions. Military analysts across NATO institutions have been tracking the gradual degradation of Russia's parade hardware as a proxy indicator for frontline depletion. The logic is straightforward. Tanks that roll through Red Square are tanks that are not being used or replaced at the front. The decision to display no military hardware at all this year tells analysts that Russia does not have spare capacity. What is at the front stays at the front. That is not the posture of a military on the verge of decisive victory. Economists monitoring Russia's wartime economy point to multiple stress fractures: inflation, labor shortages driven by casualties and emigration, declining oil revenues as Western sanctions bite and global prices fluctuate, and a state budget increasingly strained by military spending. The war is sustainable, for now, but the margin is narrowing. The consensus among serious analysts is not that Russia is about to collapse. It is that the pressure is building, the cracks are visible, and the decisions Putin makes in the next months will determine whether this war ends through negotiation, through Russian exhaustion, or through dangerous escalation. Remember the question we opened with? If Russia is winning this war, Why can Putin not safely hold his own victory parade? Here is what we now know, and it is more significant than even most experts are saying publicly. This is not just about one parade. This is about the unraveling of a narrative. And when the narrative goes, everything that was built on top of it becomes unstable. Based on everything we know, here are the three scenarios now in play. Best case, Ukraine's drone campaign, combined with the visible strain on Russia's economy and domestic mood, creates conditions for serious ceasefire negotiations by late 2026. Both sides are exhausted. International pressure, including from Washington and Beijing, pushes toward a frozen conflict or a negotiated pause. The war does not end, but the shooting slows, and diplomacy begins to have space. Putin frames this domestically as a victory, as he always does. Zelensky accepts imperfect terms because Ukraine needs to rebuild. Europe stabilizes. Likely case. The war continues at its current grinding intensity into 2027. Russia makes incremental territorial gains in Donbass, but cannot break through decisively. Ukraine continues its drone campaign, imposing costs on Russian infrastructure and morale. Western support for Ukraine remains divided and inconsistent. Putin holds power domestically by tightening information control further, no major diplomatic breakthrough. The world adapts to permanent, low-grade conflict in Europe's east. Worst case, Putin, facing accelerating domestic pressure and unable to show military progress, orders a dramatic escalation. This could mean a massive strike on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, targeting electricity and water heading into winter, or a demonstration use of a tactical nuclear device in an unpopulated area, designed to shock the West into backing down. The international response to this scenario is untested, fractured, and frighteningly unclear. This is the scenario that keeps military planners in Brussels and Washington awake at night. What to watch in the next 72 hours? Ceasefire violations. Which side breaks the holiday truce more visibly? And how Russia responds if Ukraine strikes anything near Moscow during or after the parade. Watch also for any statement from Beijing, any signal that China is either reinforcing or stepping back from its support for Moscow will tell you a great deal about which of these three scenarios is most likely. We want to hear from you on this one, because this story is genuinely contested even among people who follow it closely. Here is the first question. Do you think the shrinking of this parade represents the beginning of the end of Putin's grip on the narrative? Or is this just a one-year tactical adjustment that changes nothing fundamental about the war or his hold on power? And here is the second. Russia is threatening massive strikes on Kyiv if Ukraine attacks the Victory Day celebrations. Zelensky has announced his own ceasefire. Is there any realistic diplomatic path still open here? Or have we passed the point where either side can back down without collapsing their own domestic political position? Drop your answers below. This channel is a community, and on stories this big, the sharpest thinking often comes from you. We read every comment. 3 takeaways from everything we have covered today. 1. Putin's scaled-down Victory Day parade is not an administrative decision. It is a confession, a visible admission that the war is not going as planned, that the front is consuming resources that cannot be spared, and that the Russian capital itself is no longer safely beyond the reach of Ukrainian strikes. 2. The Kremlin lied to the world on the record about the journalist ban. Peskov denied accreditations were revoked. CNN has proof they were. In a war where information is a weapon, the Russian state is losing control of the narrative, and it knows it. 3. The mood inside Russia is shifting. Not dramatically, not dangerously for Putin, yet. But ordinary Russians are saying, quietly, to cameras in Moscow, that this war needs to end. That is a signal that cannot be dismissed. Watch the ceasefire violations in the next 48 to 72 hours. Watch for any signal from Beijing. Watch whether the next Victory Day parade, if Putin is still in power to hold it, has tanks or not. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change the trajectory of this entire conflict. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. Here is the line to carry with you. The most powerful image from Russia's 2026 Victory Day is not what was in Red Square. It is what wasn't.